In the final week of June 1944, as German commanders obsessed over the beaches of Normandy, where Allied forces had just landed in the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, another storm, far deadlier for Hitler's armies, was rising in the east. It was silent at first, hidden behind forests, swamps, and the endless Byelorussian countryside. But when it broke, it would obliterate an entire German army group, shatter the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility, and redefine the Eastern Front forever. This was Operation Bagration, an offensive so vast, so devastating, and planned with such precision that even today, historians consider it one of the most effective military campaigns ever executed. But before the Red Army unleashed its fury, before whole divisions vanished and front lines collapsed in days, there was a world of tension, error, and quiet preparation. An uneasy calm in which Germany believed, against mounting evidence, that the Soviet Union was incapable of launching a major summer offensive. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. The Eastern Front in 1944, a powder keg ready to blow. To understand why Operation Bagration became such a decisive moment, we must first return to the front lines of early 1944. By this time, the Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force that had thundered across Europe in the early years of the war. It had suffered brutal winters, catastrophic attrition, and a constant shortage of men, fuel, and equipment. Historians estimate that by spring 1944, Germany had already suffered over 4 million casualties on the Eastern Front alone. According to German records, Army Group Center stationed in Belarus was holding nearly 600 miles of front with fewer than half the troops it needed. Yet incredibly, Berlin insisted that Army Group Center remain in place, holding a line that made little strategic sense and was nearly impossible to defend. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the Red Army had undergone a transformation. After years of sacrifice and adaptation, it was now a modernized, coordinated, deadly machine. Soviet industry was producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft at a rate Germany could no longer match. Newly reorganized units such as Guards armies, shock formations, and tank corps were becoming specialized tools of breakthrough warfare. But perhaps most critically, Soviet intelligence, particularly the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had learned how to exploit German weaknesses. And this year, Stalin wanted a decisive blow. A strike so massive that it would break the back of Nazi occupation in the East. Why Bagration was planned, and why it was kept so secret. In early 1944, Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky faced a strategic puzzle. They needed to coordinate their summer offensives with the Western Allies, who were preparing their invasion of Western Europe. That invasion, known as Operation Overlord, was scheduled for June 6, 1944. The Allies needed the Soviets to attack Germany's Eastern Front simultaneously to prevent the Wehrmacht from shifting reserves westward. Stalin agreed. But behind the scenes, Soviet planners were already drafting the blueprint for the most ambitious operation of the war. What became Operation Bagration was not merely a supporting attack. It was designed as a hammer blow, a strike against the heart of German defenses. Army Group Center. Why Army Group Center? Several reasons converged. 1. It was poorly reinforced. German intelligence believed the main Soviet blow would fall in Ukraine, where previous offensives had taken place. Army Group Center was considered quiet. 2. The terrain was deceptive. Belarus was a nightmare for maneuver warfare. Dense forests, marshes, rivers, swamps. German commanders assumed no major offensive could break through it. 3. Hitler refused to allow retreat or flexibility. Army Group Center's commander, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, was given strict orders. Hold every position. Stand fast. No withdrawal. This rigid command structure would prove disastrous. 4. The Soviets wanted to liberate Belarus. The region had suffered some of the worst atrocities of the war. Civilians massacred, villages burned, partisans hunted. A decisive offensive there carried immense political and emotional weight. And so, in the spring of 1944, with nearly 2.5 million men across several fronts, the Soviet Union began preparing the most complex, coordinated, and perfectly executed attack they had ever attempted. But they did it in near-total secrecy. The deception game, how the Soviets blinded the Wehrmacht. Operation Bagration is often compared to the Allied deception plan known as Operation Bodyguard, the elaborate ruse that disguised the true location of the D-Day landings. But in the East, the Soviets achieved something equally remarkable. Through a combination of camouflage, misinformation, radio silence, and carefully staged movements, they convinced German intelligence that the main attack would come from Ukraine, not Belarus. Soviet Maskirovka deception at its finest. Maskirovka wasn't simply camouflage, it was an entire doctrine of deception. The Soviets moved entire armies at night, concealed tanks in forests under layers of foliage, built fake bridges, fake headquarters, and even fake supply depots, used decoy radio traffic to suggest troop concentrations elsewhere, deployed dummy artillery positions along hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, real positions were kept silent, hidden, and motionless. As a result, by mid-June, German intelligence dramatically underestimated Soviet strength in the north. Some estimates suggested the Red Army had as few as half the number of troops they actually possessed. Soviet commanders later recalled that even on June 21st, the night before the offensive, German reconnaissance flights were still observing empty fields where entire Soviet divisions were waiting beneath camouflage nets. Inside the German high command, denial, misjudgment, and disaster. While the Soviets built the foundation for their offensive, German command structures were collapsing under their own weight. Army Group Center, tasked with holding Belarus, consisted of several major formations. 4th Army under Kurt von Tippelskirch, 3rd Panzer Army under George Hans Reinhardt, 9th Army under Hans Jordan, 2nd Army on the southern flank. All reported to Field Marshal Ernst Busch, known for his loyalty to Hitler, but not for independent thinking. Hitler's fatal assumption. Hitler believed the Soviets were incapable of launching another major offensive so soon after their victories in Ukraine. He insisted that Army Group North Ukraine, to the south, was in greater danger and diverted reinforcements there. This left Army Group Center dangerously vulnerable. Yet the German frontline officers sensed something was wrong. Reconnaissance reports showed increasing Soviet activity. Partisan attacks intensified. New Soviet units appeared in unexpected places. A colonel in the 9th Army later recalled, "It was like the air before a thunderstorm, still heavy, charged. We reported it again and again. The answer from above was always the same: no major attack is expected." This belief was so entrenched that, in early June, some commanders were ordered to reduce their ammunition consumption, an order that would border on insanity given what was coming. The partisans, the shadow army of Belarus. No account of Operation Bagration is complete without acknowledging the role of the Belarusian partisan movement. By 1944, tens of thousands of partisans were operating in German-occupied Belarus. They sabotaged railways, attacked convoys, eliminated officials, and provided intelligence to the Red Army. In the weeks leading up to the offensive, their activities surged. Operation Rail War and Concert. According to Soviet and German reports, partisans destroyed hundreds of locomotives, thousands of meters of track, dozens of bridges. During the critical days of June 19th to 22nd, right before the Soviet artillery barrage, partisan attacks crippled German supply lines. Ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements simply couldn't move. This wasn't random sabotage. It was coordinated. The Red Army delivered radios, explosives, and trained operatives to ensure that partisan raids matched the timing of Soviet breakthroughs. One German supply officer wrote after the war, "The railways ceased to function. It was as if the ground itself rose against us." When Operation Bagration began, many German units found themselves isolated before the first Soviet shot was even fired. The Soviet forces, a colossus prepares for war. By June 1944, the Red Army surrounding Army Group Center was composed of the 1st Baltic Front, 3rd Byelorussian Front, 2nd Byelorussian Front, and 1st Byelorussian Front. These 4 massive formations were commanded by some of the most capable Soviet generals of the war. Ivan Cherniakovsky, a rising star and one of the youngest front commanders. Georgy Zhukov, serving in a coordinating role. Konstantin Rokossovsky, known for his intelligence and daring. Ivan Bagramyan, respected for his professionalism and strategic insight. Together, they commanded over 2.3 million troops, more than 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, at least 30,000 artillery pieces, and around 5,300 aircraft. Exact numbers vary by source, but historians agree that this was one of the largest concentrations of military force ever assembled in human history up to that point. Different fronts, different missions. Each Soviet front had a specific role. 3rd Byelorussian Front would attack Vitebsk and Orsha. 2nd Byelorussian Front would target Mogilev. 1st Byelorussian Front aimed at Bobruisk and the southern flank. 1st Baltic Front would support by enveloping German positions further north. The plan was not simply to push the Germans back. It was to surround and destroy them. Russia's military mastery, the operational art of deep battle. By 1944, the Red Army had mastered a new form of warfare, deep operation or glubokaya operacja. This doctrine called for massive penetration of enemy lines, fast-moving exploitation by armored units, complete encirclement, total destruction of enemy formations. Unlike early war Soviet attacks, which often relied on brute force, Bagration was meticulously planned. It involved multi-layered artillery barrages, coordinated air support, specialized assault brigades, engineers trained to break through fortified zones, and rapid shifts of reserves to maintain momentum. Even German generals later admitted that the Soviets had achieved a level of operational sophistication equal to, and sometimes surpassing, their own. The night before, June 21, 1944, on the eve of the attack, a heavy silence settled over the front. In the forests near Orsha, Soviet infantry waited quietly, many writing last letters home under the cover of darkness. Tanks sat concealed in tree lines, their engines warming only briefly at carefully timed intervals. Artillery units, lined hub to hub, adjusted firing tables by lantern light. Meanwhile, German soldiers along the front reported unusual stillness. No Soviet artillery probing, no night raids, no movement. Many German officers assumed the Soviets were redeploying south. But frontline troops, especially those with Eastern Front experience, felt a growing unease. A lieutenant in the 78th Sturm Division noted, "The forest was too quiet. No birds. The men felt it. Something was coming." In the German rear, supply officers were scrambling. Partisan attacks had destroyed key bridges. Ammunition depots were behind schedule. Trucks were out of fuel. Yet headquarters messages remained confident. No major offensive expected. At 0400 hours, hell opens. At dawn on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Front erupted. Soviet artillery, stretching for miles, unleashed a barrage of unimaginable scale. Observers described it as a rolling earthquake, a wall of sound, thunder that never stopped. The bombardment wasn't random. It was incredibly precise, targeting German bunkers, command posts, communication lines, railways, and artillery positions. German units reported that within minutes, telephone lines were cut, trenches collapsed, and entire companies were wiped out. A surviving German officer later told historians, "It felt like the world was ending. We could not hear our own thoughts. Everything shook. The earth opened." After nearly 2 hours of continuous fire, the Soviet infantry rose from the mist. Thousands of men advanced behind a creeping barrage, a moving curtain of shells timed to fall just ahead of the advancing troops. Behind them came engineers clearing minefields, then tanks, then mobile artillery, all synchronized in a deadly rhythm. Everywhere, German defenses were crumbling. But this was only the beginning. The true breakthrough would come later in the day, when Soviet armored reserves surged forward, smashing into German lines weakened by the morning assault. What happened next would transform a shattered front into a catastrophic collapse. Cliffhanger. The breakthrough begins. By midday on June 22nd, the Fourth Army's northern flank was collapsing. Vitebsk was nearly surrounded. German commanders begged for permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. Army Group Center must stand fast. But the Soviet attack was only intensifying. The armored spearheads were preparing to move. The partisans were sabotaging every escape route. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. A German captain radioed in desperation. "We are being overrun. If help does not come immediately, it will be too late." No help came. And on the Soviet side, commanders were already preparing the next phase. The encirclement battles that would annihilate entire German corps. The floodgates had opened. An army group center was about to be swept away. Dawn broke over Belarus like a curtain of fire. By the time the sun lifted above the tree line on June 22, 1944, the German Fourth Army was already reeling from the shock of the Soviet bombardment. Entire battalions were buried under collapsed trenches. Artillery batteries lay silent, their crews wiped out before they could fire a shot. Smoke drifted through the forests, clinging to the ground like a second fog. But the real disaster began as the Soviet infantry surged forward. The first breaches. Outside Vitebsk, General Cherniakovsky's 3rd Byelorussian front struck with surgical precision. Assault engineer companies, sappers armed with explosives, wire cutters, and flamethrowers, stormed the German strongpoints. Where German machine gun nests held out, Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed overhead, battering them into silence. One German officer remembered, "We survived the barrage," only to find entire Soviet regiments already in our trenches. The Soviets didn't simply advance. They flowed around bunkers, over embankments, through smoke screens. Their formations had rehearsed these actions for months, and it showed. Within hours, the first defensive line was splintering. To the south, Rokossovsky's 1st Byelorussian front launched its own massive blow toward Bobruisk. Here the terrain was swampy, choked with reeds and marshland the Germans believed impassable. They were wrong. Soviet infantry advanced through knee-deep water, supported by amphibious vehicles and rafts improvised by engineers. Tank units followed on narrow paths cleared overnight. What German commanders assumed was a natural defense line turned into a fatal trap. Desperation at Vitebsk. By mid-morning, the situation in Vitebsk was catastrophic. 4 German divisions were collapsing under the Soviet assault. Communications with Army Group Center headquarters were intermittent, sometimes dead entirely. At 11 a.m., General George Hans Reinhardt, commander of the 3rd Panzer Army, sent an urgent message to Field Marshal Busch. "Vitebsk cannot be held. Immediate permission to withdraw required." Hitler refused. He insisted Vitebsk be declared a fortress city, a designation that meant its garrison must fight to the last man. Reinhardt warned that this would lead to total encirclement. The answer returned unchanged: stand fast. Meanwhile, Soviet armored spearheads were already pushing through the gaps created by the morning assault. T-34s roared through the smoke, firing as they moved, leaving shattered German positions in their wake. The German infantry, outnumbered and nearly deafened from the barrage, had no reserves and little direction. Survivors streamed eastward, only to find partisan roadblocks and destroyed bridges slowing every retreat. A Soviet officer later wrote, "By noon, the enemy front no longer existed. Only isolated pockets of resistance remained. And those pockets were shrinking by the minute." Rokossovsky's gamble. While Vitebsk was collapsing, another drama was unfolding further south. Marshal Rokossovsky, arguably the most methodical commander in the Soviet High Command, had prepared a stunning double envelopment around Bobruisk. He planned to pin the German 9th Army in place, strike north and south simultaneously, and close a massive pocket behind them. But to do it, he needed Stalin's approval for a controversial idea: a 2-direction breakthrough in swampy terrain. At a meeting days earlier, Stalin questioned the plan 3 separate times. Rokossovsky held firm. "I consider it necessary to attack in both directions." Stalin unusually relented. Now that decision was paying off. Soviet troops tore through the German 35th and 41st Corps. Armored units surged across makeshift causeways, widening the breach. German commanders attempted desperate counterattacks, but most were mauled before they even reached the Soviet lines. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and overwhelmed by the Red Air Force, was barely present. Soviet pilots roamed the skies, hammering German columns attempting to reposition. By late afternoon, Rokossovski's northern and southern thrusts were converging. The trap was beginning to close. Hitler's paralysis. While the front disintegrated, messages piled up at Army Group Center headquarters. Commanders demanded permission to withdraw, to regroup, to avoid encirclement. Hitler refused each one. He insisted, no retreat from Vitebsk, no retreat from Orsha, no retreat from Mogilev. The frontline generals protested, but Busch, loyal and cautious, relayed Hitler's orders without challenge. A German diary from the 9th Army captured the mood. We are being asked to hold the impossible. The High Command is blind. This is no longer war, it is suicide. The result was predictable. With every passing hour, the Soviet advance accelerated. The Soviet spearheads break free. By evening on June 22nd, the first major breakthroughs were complete. Near Vitebsk, Soviet forces had encircled multiple divisions. At Orsha, German defenses were cracking under relentless pressure. South of Bobruisk, armored columns reached the Berezina River far ahead of schedule. Partisans attacked German retreat routes, blowing up the remaining rail lines. Soviet commanders were astonished at how quickly the front was collapsing. What they expected to take days was happening in hours. But this was only the first phase. What came next would annihilate whole German armies. By the morning of June 23rd, the city of Vitebsk, once considered a cornerstone of Army Group Center's northern defenses, was already half surrounded. Smoke curled from burning warehouses, shattered rail yards, and the ruins of administrative buildings. For German troops inside the city, the world had narrowed to rubble-filled streets and the constant thunder of Soviet artillery. The garrison commander, General Friedrich Gallwitzer, sent frantic reports to higher HQ. The Soviets were closing from the north, south, and east. Every bridge out of the city was under fire. Ammunition was running low. But the answer from Field Marshal Busch, relaying Hitler's orders, remained unchanged. Hold Vitebsk to the last. No units may withdraw. Officers in the 206th and 246th Infantry Divisions argued that staying meant annihilation. But they were bound by orders. So the German divisions dug in, fortifying ruined buildings, preparing for house-to-house fighting. For the Soviets, this was exactly what they wanted. The trap snapped shut. While German troops defended street corners and stairwells, Cherniakovsky's 3rd Byelorussian Front executed its final maneuver. South of the city, Soviet tank brigades bypassed resistance and raced toward the Dwina River. Assault troops seized key crossings. Artillery units rolled forward, unlimbering their guns almost at firing distance. By noon, the Soviet pincers met. Vitebsk was fully encircled. More than 30,000 German troops were trapped, cut off from supplies, reinforcement, or retreat. A Soviet observer recalled, "We could see the city burning in the distance. The Germans were fighting bravely, but they were isolated. Their radios were begging for permission to escape. We knew it would not come." A last, desperate plea. Inside Vitebsk, Gallwitzer desperately pleaded for the one thing that could save his men: permission to break out. He argued they could retreat to the west, form a new defensive line, and rejoin the Kampfgruppen forming outside the pocket. The 4th Army commander agreed. Reinhardt agreed, but Hitler did not. He insisted Vitebsk must be defended to the last cartridge. When the order arrived, one German officer reportedly slammed his fist against a wall, shouting, "He is sacrificing us for nothing." By evening, Soviet troops were already pushing into the suburbs. House-to-house fighting. June 24th brought brutal urban combat. Soviet assault groups, armed with submachine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers, moved block by block. Tanks rolled forward cautiously, blasting strongpoints one at a time. Engineers cleared barricades under fire. German defenders fought tenaciously, but with no air support, dwindling ammunition, and nowhere to fall back, their situation was hopeless. One battalion commander described the chaos. It was smoke, fire, shouting, the crash of explosives, and the terrible knowledge that no help would come. By afternoon, Soviet troops reached the city center. Gallwitzer, facing the collapse of all positions, finally ordered his remaining forces to attempt a breakout, directly violating Hitler's command. But it was too late. Soviet units had already sealed the last escape routes. Columns trying to flee were cut down by artillery, machine gun fire, and air attacks. Few made it out. The fall of Vitebsk. On the night of June 24th to 25th, the pocket disintegrated. Some German groups surrendered. Others scattered into the forests, hunted by partisans and Soviet reconnaissance units. By morning, organized resistance had ended. Vitebsk, a fortress city that Hitler demanded be held at all costs, had fallen in less than 48 hours. For German divisions ceased to exist. A Soviet war correspondent wrote, "We walked through the city, through burned-out streets and shattered bunkers. It was a graveyard for an entire army." What had happened to Vitebsk was not an isolated disaster. It was the beginning of a domino effect. The collapse continues. Orsha and the Tiger Line. With Vitebsk gone, the next German defensive anchor, Orsha, became the focus of Soviet pressure. Orsha was heavily fortified and protected by the so-called Panther Tiger Line, a belt of trenches, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and obstacles designed to slow any Soviet breakthrough. But German hopes that the line could buy time were unrealistic. The line had never been fully completed. Some sections had no mines. Others had unmanned trenches. Hitler's fortified front existed more on paper than in reality. On June 25th, Soviet troops from Cherniakovsky's Fifth Army tore into the weak spots, blasting apart anti-tank defenses and overwhelming the forward strongpoints. Meanwhile, Elite Guard's tank units moved through the gaps, racing toward the Minsk-Moscow highway. The German 78th Sturm Division, the best-equipped formation in the sector, fought stubbornly, but it was outnumbered and isolated. When Soviet armor executed a wide flanking maneuver, the division was nearly surrounded. By evening, Orsha was abandoned. The Tiger Line had collapsed in a single day. The road to Minsk opens. With Vitebsk destroyed and Orsha shattered, the Red Army now had a clear path to one of the most important objectives of the entire campaign. Minsk, the heart of Army Group Center. The road west lay wide open, and the Soviet commanders intended to exploit it with everything they had. Rokossovsky's spearheads were already moving. Bagramian's tanks were pushing from the north. Cherniakovsky was clearing the center. The German High Command did not yet understand the scale of the disaster, but soon it would. By July 2, 1944, the offensive that Hitler dismissed as impossible had already become one of the worst catastrophes in German military history. Soviet spearheads were advancing faster than any Red Army operation before them, sometimes 20 to 40 kilometers a day. Behind them lay the wreckage of entire German corps, shattered in forests, along riverbanks, and on the hot Byelorussian roads. Now only one objective remained: Minsk, the nerve center of Army Group Center. If Minsk fell, the German front in the east would disintegrate. The Minsk pocket closes. On July 3rd, Soviet tank forces from the 2nd and 3rd Byelorussian fronts converged west of Minsk. Their treads kicked up clouds of dust as they reached the highway junctions that German columns were desperately using to retreat. T-34s and IS-2 heavy tanks crashed into panicked convoys. Fuel trucks, staff cars, half-tracks, medical wagons, all entangled in miles-long chaos. By noon, Soviet pincers met. Minsk was surrounded. Inside the pocket were more than 100,000 German soldiers, most exhausted, starving, and disorganized. Some divisions had been reduced from 12,000 men to fewer than 1,000. Others existed only as clusters of stragglers wandering the forests, hoping to find a gap that no longer existed. A Soviet general wrote, "We closed the ring like a trapdoor. After that, it was only a matter of time." The end of the pocket. For 4 days, German forces attempted breakout after breakout, night attacks, forest infiltrations, attacks behind makeshift smoke screens. But the Soviets were ready. Artillery sealed the roads. Aircraft struck daylight columns mercilessly. Infantry divisions blocked every track and clearing. By July 7th, resistance had collapsed. German generals, including the commander of the Fourth Army, were captured in uniform, dust-covered and hollow-eyed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered in groups, raising makeshift white flags, shirts, bandages, rags tied to sticks. The once proud Army Group Center had ceased to exist. A collapse greater than Stalingrad. According to post-war analysis and German records, Operation Bagration cost Germany over 300,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, 28 to 34 divisions destroyed. The loss of Belarus and eastern Poland, thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles. The scale exceeded even Stalingrad. But the psychological impact was even greater. The Wehrmacht, once considered the most feared fighting force on Earth, had suffered a defeat so sudden and complete that German morale never fully recovered. A German colonel later admitted, "After Bagration, we knew the war was lost. There was no replacing what died in Belarus." Why Germany never saw it coming? Historians today point to several decisive factors. 1. Soviet deception, Maskirovka. The Red Army hid troop movements so effectively that German intelligence misread the direction of the blow until the last possible moment. 2. Hitler's rigid command. His refusal to allow withdrawals turned local penetrations into massive encirclements. 3. Partisan warfare. Belarusian partisans crippled rail lines at the exact moment the Wehrmacht needed them most. 4. Overstretched German lines. Army Group Center held far too much territory with far too few troops. 5. Soviet operational mastery. For the first time, the Red Army executed deep battle exactly as theorized. Breakthrough, exploitation, encirclement, destruction. Operation Bagration wasn't just a victory. It was a demonstration of how far the Soviet Union had come since the dark days of 1941. The human cost. Belarus suffered terribly under occupation, burned villages, mass executions, forced labor. For many civilians, the Soviet advance brought liberation, but also devastation. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Fields were littered with wreckage. Survivors emerged from cellars to find their communities gone forever. A Belarusian witness recalled, "When the fighting passed, the silence was worse. There were no houses left, only chimneys. The cost of liberation was immense. An offensive that changed the course of the war." By the time the Red Army reached the outskirts of Warsaw in late July, the map of Eastern Europe was transformed. Germany's Eastern Front had collapsed. The road to Berlin was no longer a distant dream. It was visible, inevitable, and closer every day. In military academies today, Operation Bagration is studied as a masterpiece of planning, deception, coordination, and execution, one of the most perfectly organized offensives in modern warfare. The operation did not just destroy an army. It shattered the illusion of German invincibility. It reshaped the war. It reshaped Europe. And it reminded the world that the Soviet Union, once pushed to the brink of annihilation, had risen back with a force no empire could withstand. The final word. Operation Bagration was more than a battle. It was a reckoning, a superpower's return, a nation's vengeance, and the offensive Germany never saw coming until it was too late.